Jimmy Swaggart's death sent a tremor through the faith community. A man once revered as a beacon of revival and redemption was gone. In Baton Rouge, thousands gathered to pay their final respects. The sanctuary was draped in solemn quiet. Tissues were clutched tightly. Heads were bowed in prayer. Hearts were heavy. At the front row of the church, dressed in graceful black, sat Frances Anderson. To most, she appeared composed, unshaken. But behind that calm exterior was something no one else could see. Not grief. Not entirely. Something deeper. A storm. She stared ahead, unmoving, eyes locked on the pulpit. No tears. No trembling. But her posture, tense, heavy, spoke volumes. She wasn't just mourning a husband. She was carrying a truth that was never supposed to be told. Moments later, Donnie Swaggart, Jimmy's only son, approached the pulpit. With a Bible in hand and grief in his voice, he delivered a heartfelt tribute to his father, honoring his decades of ministry, his global television reach, and the countless souls touched by his sermons. The crowd wept. Some nodded. Others whispered prayers. But Frances? She didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Because while the world remembered Jimmy's victories, she remembered the things he never confessed publicly, the things he only shared with her days before he died. Frances, he had whispered, frail and full of regret, the truth has to come out. You've waited long enough. That one sentence echoed in her mind as Donnie stood center stage, basking in the spotlight, preaching perfection, painting a legacy. But Frances knew the truth. The world would too. In the days after Jimmy's funeral, glowing tributes flooded television screens. Donations rolled in. Social media lit up with praise. Meanwhile, behind the doors of the Swaggart estate, something darker was brewing. The ministry, now under Donnie's full control, moved forward quickly. Too quickly. Frances, once the silent backbone beside Jimmy, watched in quiet disgust. Her grief was now mixed with something else, a burden, a final confession, a weight Jimmy left behind. Because in his final moments, Jimmy wasn't the preacher anymore. He was a man, broken, honest, and afraid of what he'd hidden for too long. He told Frances everything. About Donnie. I kept secrets to protect him, Jimmy admitted, but they've become too heavy to carry. Financial manipulation. Misuse of ministry power. NDAs. Hush money. Abuse hidden beneath scripture. And then, silence. Jimmy made peace with God. And left the consequences with her. Frances didn't know what to do. At first, she mourned quietly. But every day, as Donnie gave interviews and performed sermons with new intensity, something inside her cracked. The charm, the charisma, it all looked different now. Manufactured. A show. Then came the email. No greeting. No signature. Just one line. You know what Donnie did. We all do. What will you do about it? Frances stared at the screen for what felt like hours. Her hands trembled. She wasn't alone. The silence she had carried for years wasn't just hers anymore. Others knew. Others were waiting. And for the first time in decades, something inside Frances ignited. She had stood by Jimmy through scandal, betrayal, humiliation. She had kept her head down. Protected the name. Protected Donnie. But now Jimmy was gone. And Donnie? He had claimed the throne. But Frances had the truth. One morning, inside the cold, echoing halls of the Swaggart estate, Frances sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of untouched tea. Sleep no longer came. Peace no longer existed. 4 days, she'd gone through boxes Jimmy left behind. Photos, sermon notes, scribbled prayers. Among them, buried deep in her walk-in closet, hidden beneath decades of ministry memorabilia, she found it. A leather-bound journal. Her journal. 10 years of secrets poured onto its pages, not meant to be read, only meant to survive. Inside were stories of quiet threats, financial cover-ups, late-night arguments with Donnie, the gradual transformation of the ministry, from a mission to a brand. And the women. She didn't name them. She didn't have to. She wrote about the patterns, the encounters that staff worked overtime to silence, the hush money, the transfers, the NDAs, all designed to bury the sins and protect the Swaggart name. She had even documented the moment Jimmy stopped trying to stop it. He looked the other way, not out of malice but weariness, guilt, fear that the entire empire would collapse. Frances had written everything, and she was ready to burn it, until someone found it first. It was Maria, the longtime housekeeper, the woman who had seen too much and said nothing for decades. She was cleaning the closet when she found the journal, and instead of ignoring it, she flipped it open. What she read sent chills down her spine. And suddenly, Frances was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a witness. Maria had been cleaning out Frances's room, just another quiet afternoon in Baton Rouge, when she accidentally knocked over the old cedar chest. A worn leather journal tumbled out. She knew she shouldn't read it, but curiosity is a powerful thing. Maria opened it. Just a few pages. But what she read shook her to the core. Her hands trembled as she returned the journal to its hiding place. That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She reached out to someone she once trusted with her own secrets. Her message was brief, but heavy. By morning, whispers had already started, circulating in corners of the ministry no one had dared question for years. Retired staff members suddenly reappeared. A former accountant, long silent, began asking the same old questions. Quiet circles were forming. And Frances? She had no idea her journal had already begun to stir an awakening. But deep down, she always knew the truth wouldn't stay buried forever. Her grief still lived inside her. But something stronger had taken hold now, resolve. If the journal ever came to light, she was ready. Inside the ministry, something had shifted. Donnie Swaggart felt it first. The atmosphere had grown tense. Staff were polite but distant. A few longtime employees requested sudden time off. Maria, the housekeeper, wouldn't meet his eyes. And Frances, she had gone quieter than usual. But her silence felt different now. It wasn't defeat. It was defiance. Measured. Unshakable. Donnie wasn't new to pressure. He'd grown up watching his father command crowds with fire and charisma. He could read a room in seconds. And he knew something was coming. Then it happened. A private email hit his inbox. No message. Just a screenshot. A journal page. Frances's handwriting. His name, scrawled next to two chilling words, cover up and threat. Without knocking, Donnie burst into Frances's sitting room that evening. She sat in her usual chair, Bible open in her lap, calm as ever. Frances didn't flinch. I gave them nothing. He threw the paper onto the table. Then explain this. She looked at it, page 43. The girl from Tulsa. She remembered the night she wrote it. I didn't give it to anyone, Frances said quietly. But maybe it was time someone found it. His voice dropped to a low growl. You've lost your mind. Do you know what this could do? To the ministry? To my name? To everything Dad built? Frances closed her Bible and looked up. I know exactly what it could do. And I know what it's already done to the people you used. For a long moment, silence. Donnie's anger burned in his eyes. But behind it? Fear. Real fear. Frances leaned forward. I covered for you, because your father begged me to. But he's gone now. I won't carry this anymore. You think anyone will believe you? Donnie hissed. Over me? Over this ministry? People love me, Frances. She didn't blink. Let's hope they never have to choose. Because if they do, I trust they'll see the truth. He stood there, fists clenched, breath shallow, cornered. For the first time, not in control. Frances held the journal, not as a threat, but as a symbol. I'm not seeking revenge, Donnie, she whispered. This is release. The truth has waited long enough. He turned and walked out without a word. But both of them knew. It started small. But whispers are hard to contain. That one leaked page set off a quiet storm across Baton Rouge. Former staff, once scattered, silenced, forgotten, began answering messages they'd ignored for years. Private group chats formed overnight. Secret phone calls. Nervous texts. Fear was everywhere. Fear of lawsuits. Fear of Donnie's loyalists. fear of being blacklisted by religious communities they once called home. But something else was growing too, guilt. Because many of them knew they had been part of something that hurt people. And now, finally, some were ready to speak. Angela Moore, a former secretary who spent over 7 years at the ministry, agreed to an anonymous interview with a small Christian watchdog blog. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I loved working there. I really did. I believed in the mission. But then, people started disappearing. Women mostly. There were settlements. And we were told not to ask questions. Donnie had people who made sure of that." Soon after, Leonard "Len" Stroud, a retired senior accountant from Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, spoke to an independent journalist. He had left quietly in 2017, frustrated and ignored. "When I asked why donor funds were being rerouted without approval, I was told it was above my level. But I was the senior accountant. Nothing should have been above my level. That's when I knew something was being hidden." The stories piled up. Manipulation, misused money, intimidation. And the shocking part? These weren't outsiders. These were insiders. Loyal ones. People who had loved Jimmy. Who had respected Donnie. Who had believed. Now they were finding strength in each other. Behind the scenes, a former HR assistant began collecting testimonies, protected legally. A few attorneys offered to help pro bono. A nonprofit specializing in church abuse cases stepped in quietly. There was talk of a joint statement, a collective reckoning, an undeniable truth. When word reached Frances, she was stunned. She never imagined others would step forward. She had written that journal to clear her conscience, not to spark a revolution. But now, seeing their courage, hearing their pain, she realized it belonged to all of them. And the walls of silence that had protected the Swaggart name for decades were finally beginning to crumble. The cracks weren't caused by headlines or hungry reporters. They came from within. Whispers, murmurs, ordinary people, tired of secrets, finally decided they wouldn't stay silent any longer. And Donnie? For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling the story. At first, the storm moved quietly. A leaked journal. Anonymous testimonies. Blog interviews no one was supposed to see. They circulated through private Facebook groups, church forums, hushed conversations between ex-congregants and weary pastors. But then, one email changed everything. A mid-level religion editor at a well-known digital outlet opened a forwarded message from a trusted contact. The subject line? She almost ignored it. Until she saw the name. Frances Anderson. The widow of Jimmy Swaggart. The quiet one. The backbone of the ministry. She had never chased fame, never published a book, never gone viral. But now, her name was attached to the growing storm. This wasn't noise anymore. By the end of the week, headlines emerged. It didn't go viral right away. But within Christian circles, watchdog groups, and ministry networks, it spread like wildfire. Then came the media interest. Religion podcasts began dissecting the leak. A local Louisiana station sent a camera crew to the ministry gates, but they were turned away. And then, the real shift. A national Sunday newspaper ran a front-page column. This wasn't gossip. It was carefully sourced. It cited financial records, direct staff interviews, and authenticated snippets of the journal. And it asked the questions no one had dared to ask. Why had so many staff quietly resigned over the years? What happened to the young women who'd received ministry settlements? And why was no one scrutinizing the financial trail between family and donations? Suddenly, the silence was broken. Satellite trucks rolled in. Reporters waited outside the worship center. No statement came. But the public? They were listening now. TikTok creators began dramatic readings of the journal. YouTube channels pieced together timelines. Online forums exploded with theories. Some cried witch hunt. Others whispered, finally, justice. But one thing was clear, this wasn't going away. Donnie, once the face of televised revival, was now the center of growing controversy. And Frances, silent for decades, had become the voice of a reckoning. Inside the ministry, panic took hold. Emergency meetings. Legal teams on standby. Phones wiped. Emails deleted. But it was too late. The truth, once a whisper, was now a scream. And at the center of it all stood Frances. Still grieving. Still quiet. But no longer afraid. She had spent her entire life in the background, standing beside Jimmy, supporting in silence, smiling on cue. But now, as the world poured over her private words, as questions grew louder, she knew silence could no longer be her shield. The calls didn't stop. Reporters, former friends, legal advisors, everyone wanted her to speak. She said nothing. Until one night at 2 a.m., she sat alone at her kitchen table, the same table where she once prayed with Jimmy before every broadcast. And with trembling hands, she opened her laptop and began to type. No press conference. No cameras. Just a 3-page PDF released through her attorney. But once it hit the internet, everything changed. Her words read in part, "For years, I remained silent. Not out of fear, but out of duty. I believed protecting the ministry meant protecting those who led it. But silence, I've learned, can be just as damaging as wrongdoing. After Jenny passed, I began to unpack the memories I'd buried to keep the peace. I do not write this to attack anyone. I love Donnie. I always will. But love requires accountability. To the staff who were hurt, to the families, to those who gave with pure hearts, I'm sorry. I should have spoken. I should have listened. I will carry my guilt, but I will not carry it in silence." The world froze. News anchors read her words aloud with disbelief. A woman once known for quiet loyalty was now confronting the very empire she helped build. But what stunned people the most? She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She was calm. Devastatingly honest. No lawsuits. No blame games. Just truth. Inside the ministry, the fallout was immediate. Donnie held a closed-door staff meeting. Board members began to distance themselves. Longtime donors stopped giving. And the once bulletproof Swaggart name was now fragile. But across churches and communities, something else was happening. People cried. People confessed. People began to confront their own silence. Because in that moment, Frances wasn't just a preacher's wife. She was a voice. A voice of quiet rebellion. A voice of truth in a space too often built on silence. A voice that, finally, people were ready to hear. And after 5 days of fallout, the empire she helped build was still standing. But its foundation would never be the same again. On Friday night, the silence finally broke. Christian news outlets had been circling for days, releasing headline after headline, but through it all, Donnie Swaggart said nothing. Not a denial. Not a word. Just silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than sermons. Behind closed doors, insiders whispered. Would he protect his ministry at all costs? Would he discredit his own mother to salvage the legacy he inherited? Or would he simply disappear, hoping the storm would pass? Then, an unexpected announcement hit the ministry's official social media pages. And just like that, the entire Christian world held its breath. From the outside, nothing had changed. The sanctuary still shimmered with gold trim and familiar choir robes. The red carpet was immaculate. But inside, something was different. The atmosphere was thick. No laughter. No greetings. Just anticipation and a quiet kind of dread. Then Donnie walked out. No Bible in hand. Just a dark suit. A clenched jaw. And a silence that weighed more than any sermon he had ever preached. He stepped up to the pulpit, adjusted the microphone, and after a long pause, he began. I never imagined I would have to stand here and defend myself, especially not against voices from my own home. His words were controlled. Heavy. Calculated. I love my mother. Always have. I stood beside her as she buried my father. I would never intentionally bring her harm. But let me be clear, some of what's been said, it's not true. Some things have been twisted. Some are deeply personal matters that never should have been dragged into public. The pause. Longer this time. The sanctuary was still. Yes, I've made mistakes. I've wrestled with weakness. I've leaned on the Lord in the dark seasons of my life. But I have also poured everything I am into this ministry. I've given my life to it. And I'm not walking away. His voice cracked, just slightly. To those who feel hurt, I hear you. And to those demanding accountability, I understand. Then the shift. That's why I've requested a full internal review by our ministry board. Effective immediately, I will step aside from preaching duties until the review is complete. This is not a resignation. This is not an admission of guilt. This is an act of trust in God, in the process, and in the truth, because it will outlive every rumor. And with that, he stepped back. No dramatic tears. No pleading. Just stillness. The reaction was instant. Some stood and applauded, clinging to loyalty, maybe even to denial. Others remained seated, their eyes clouded with uncertainty. Across the country, thousands watched the live stream in stunned silence. Chat rooms lit up with divided reactions. "We love you, Donnie." That wasn't accountability, it was damage control. And in a modest home just blocks away from the church, Frances sat alone. Watching the son she raised try to steady a ship already taking on water. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just folded her hands and stared at the screen. Because deep down she knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Later that night, a major Christian podcast called it the calm before the storm. What would the board's internal review really reveal? Could it even be trusted? No one knew. But one thing was certain, Donnie had spoken. Frances had spoken. And now, the truth, no matter how carefully they tried to contain it, was slipping free. And somewhere between loyalty and conscience, a line had been crossed. And this time, even faith might not be enough to hold it all together.